Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this week. Sorry for those of you that joined in last week and I wasn't there. I was a little under the weather and couldn't do the stream last week, so apologies for that. And nobody could cover for me at the last minute. So, anyways, once again, this is our weekly live stream on game design and game production and everything else related to game development. And this week we have a special guest star, Maxine. I'll let her
Hi.
introduce herself here in a second. And so please give her a warm welcome today. And she's going to be joining us on today's topics about talking about non-traditional gaming jobs. And so we'll explain that here in a minute, what that means. So Maxine?
Thanks so much, Troy. I love being called a star. That's so special to me. So I'm the career development manager here at CG Spectrum College. My background is a little more on the VFX side of things. That's where I've worked pretty much the entire part of my career. So that's my background. I don't have as much of a background in game design like Troy does, but I've noticed a really big trend of a lot of this crossover work happening between film and games and the different skills that a lot of these companies are looking for nowadays. So I thought it'd be important to chat about it with Troy today on the stream and talk about, maybe some options that some students or professionals can consider when looking at studying game design or, thinking about what skills they might have and where those can take them outside of some of those more traditional game studio roles that we know about. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Maxine.
Yeah, no problem.
So first of all, just saying hi to Big Glob of Glue and Rushback and
So many people today.
you know, Trashard and Megan and Alexia. I recognize a few of you. So welcome to anybody new, and thanks again to everybody who's my regulars for joining this week. So this week our goal, is to kind of talk about kind of on the recruiting, hiring side, I guess you want to call it, or whatever, of letting you understand that as a game designer or game developer, and really today's talk is going to be talking more about game design. But really, this is very applicable whether you're a game artist or a game programmer or working games at all. And really, what today's conversation is about is to open your eyes that often we get into games to be a game developer, right? Whether you're a game designer or whatever, and we go get a degree in that, and we may work in that professionally for a number of years even, and be in games, right? But really your skill set, is very applicable into many kind of what I call related areas, related fields. And you don't have to be making video games, right? Whether that's a PC or console or mobile game or whatever it is, we'll call them traditional video games, right? You don't have to be making those to have a job, using your skill sets, right? And this is really important to understand, because as your career advances, you may get tired of making video games, you may not like it. Or, for example, I've had friends who, for family reasons or certain reasons, got locked into a certain city. And the city they were in did not have any game developers. There was no companies there for them to work at. And they got stuck, and they ended up getting kind of other jobs outside of the industry, not using their skill sets because they couldn't move, for various reasons. Now, with COVID and other things, I think our industry for now is opening more up to remote working. So that may or may not be a reason. But I still think it's an important thing to understand that if you're physically wanting to work in an office or work someplace and you're in a town that doesn't have game development, or you're just tired of it, or whatever reason, that it's good to understand that your skill set's very applicable into other areas, right? And also, just if you're starting off and you're thinking about coming to CG Spectrum or a school and getting a degree, and you're worried about being too typecast into one role, I want you to understand through today's talk that there's literally dozens, if not hundreds of other jobs that you can go even upon graduation, go work in, that are not just about making video games. And so these skill sets are very applicable into a lot of other areas. And so we're going to kind of go through those today and try to get you to understand where and how, especially as a game designer, those skill sets are going to be able to be applied into other areas and other job categories. So, anyways, Maxine, do you want to start with anything, or do you have so from an HR kind of recruiting, hiring perspective, what's your take on kind of, game developers, working in other areas that are related? Like, what do you see as far as trends or hiring or things like that from your perspective?
Well, it's a really common question that I get from a lot of students. A lot of students are worried about their previous careers or other skills that they might have, and that not being in line with the goals that they want to have in the future or the jobs that they want. But actually, I see it as a huge asset. So people that have a background in another field, whether it's development or design, and they're looking into branching out into another industry, most of those skills are seen as a really big asset. If you're someone that has managed, let's say a game project in the past or developed your own game, um, those are skills that are transferable to a whole number of other jobs out there. So from a recruiting standpoint, usually we would see that as an asset. So people that are interested in different fields, it shows that they have a passion for other parts of the industry or different technologies or different advancements that we're seeing now in the industry, that they're not just focused on one thing. I could see it sometimes hindering some people when they're like, I just want to work at Blizzard. All I care about is this one game that I love to play. And they forget that there's different elements that make up, the production of one game. Or, sometimes you don't even get to choose the games that you work on when you join some of these big studios. So there's so many different factors to kind of get into, but I generally see it as an asset if different parts of other industries.
Yeah, I agree, and there's a lot of overlap. People that you've got to see that that not only are these things applicable, and they may not be games. Like there's a perception. A lot of people that get into games, they get into them because they think they're fun, and they think that working in games is going to be this incredible thing. And what you often sometimes quickly realize is game development is not as glorious as it sounds like for a lot of people. To Maxine's point of like, sometimes we get put on projects we don't like, or we get on teams or companies that are very toxic or have issues, and things. I'm not trying to scare you away from our industry. Like, the game industry is amazing, right? And don't get me wrong, I've been in it for almost 30 years, and I love it, and I get up every day and I absolutely love my job. But there's sometimes those days where you wake up and you're like, man, I'm just tired of this thing and want to change, right? And sometimes in these other industries that we'll talk about, there's a lot more stability, right? And there's a lot more other things. And so they may not be, your perception of this thing may not be as fun initially, but really a lot of the work is, and the skill set not only transfers, but you may find that the challenge is just as cool or just as unique. So for example, for me as a game designer, really to take the word game out of there, right? At heart, I'm a designer. And as a designer, the things that I do to design something, whether that's a physical product or, a theme park, or, now I'm working on esports, venues and all these things, whether it's a software product to whatever it is I'm working on, I see the same challenge in that it's all about like, how do I design this product, right? How do I understand users and user experiences and things like that? And so I get off on that. That's what makes me really excited every day about how do I design things better and be a better designer. It's not about being a game designer, right? A game designer is kind of icing on the cake, but I still just love being a designer and problem solving what it is to be a designer, right? And so that part of me, even though it may not be as creative in working in another field, I still really enjoy just the job of being a designer, in the same way that you might enjoy the job of modeling, say, 3D characters, right? And whether you're modeling those for a game or whether you're modeling those for a military simulation company, right? You're still potentially modeling tanks or modeling, infantry characters, and your day-to-day job might be really close and really similar. So don't overlook these other areas as being like, oh, they're not in games, they're not going to be fun, I'm not going to be happy, right? I think that through a lot of these things, we can still find happiness in our jobs if we're with a good group of people and working on a project that we really enjoy, right?
Totally. Especially at the beginning of your career, like I think a lot of people think that they're going to get that dream job right away. But usually you have to try a few things first, and trying something that might be outside of your comfort zone or outside of that dream job realm could give you that experience in order to get that dream job in the future. So some of these different like job ideas out there could just be stepping stones towards that thing that you do want. So that's something to keep in mind too. Like, this isn't a forever thing. You won't necessarily be typecast into one specific role, as long as you continue being a problem solver and continue like looking to the future and planning the different steps or things that you might need to get to where you want to be eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky for a lot of us in that, again, we get fixated on games being fun, but personally, over the years, while don't get me wrong, again, I love making games, but I also have part of me that wants to give back to the world and have social impact, for example. And so over the years, I've done a bunch of consulting projects that were things that would be kind of semi-educational games or things that had some social impact in the world. I did some consulting for the United Nations, for example, and the World Food Program, and I built a game, kind of an educational experience called Food Force. And Food Force was designed to teach kids about hunger and how to feed people and things like that. And I did that not because I was getting paid, but because I wanted to do something that would have impact in the world and change it. So here I was able to use my skills and go do something for me that had impact in the world that wasn't just about making a game, right? And it had other meaning. And so keep that in the back of your mind too, that some of these other jobs that are non-traditional can bring you more value to your life if you're like me or things like that. So while the day-to-day job may not be perceived as fun, I get more personal satisfaction out of some of those jobs and doing some of those jobs because I feel like I'm helping somebody, right? And so for me, that levels off the like, oh, it's not as creative, but I still enjoy the challenge, and I enjoy the fact that I can have some real impact on the world. And games like Food Force maybe didn't change the world, but 4 million kids played it. And there was a lot of people that got to play it and learn about hunger in the world. And I don't know what long-term impact that had, but I'm still very excited that I was able to do a project like that had some impact, on and helped some people's lives. And so that brought a lot of fulfillment, to me. So I just want you to keep an open mind on today's topics and understand that, again, there's a lot of potential opportunity out there. So let's dive in. What I wanted to kind of first talk about is just kind of some of the skill transfer, right? And what kinds of skills, specifically as a game designer, transfer over. Now, real quick, if you're a game artist or you're a game engineer or you're working in any other aspects of games, I would argue that it's almost a one-to-one transfer. So that doesn't necessarily mean that 100%, if you're currently a character modeler or an environment modeler or working in some kind of other field, or area within games, that's going to perfectly transfer over to all of these things, but it's pretty close. So for example, as a game modeler, you might be working on lower poly characters, you might be working on more optimized characters, and if you go into movie pre-production or something or doing movie visual effects, you may have much higher poly counts or much more, higher resolution characters, which Maxine can talk about, here in a second. So there is some slight skill differences, right? Some slight skill things depending on if you're doing pre-rendered stuff versus in-game things and stuff like that. But the delta of learning is pretty small, and the delta of difference there between those things is really small. But Maxine, since you come from a film background, do you want to talk about just kind of what you see as far as people coming, say, from a games background or either in art or in engineering specifically, and coming into, like, say, movie pre-production or movie production in general, like how you see that transfer, work, or how do you see the skill sets transfer between those two worlds?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is about virtual production now is it's such a new technology that there's still so much learning happening. So it's a really great time to actually get into it now, because even some of the biggest companies out there, ILM is talking a lot about Mandalorian. Season 2 just came out. That was a big virtual production show. Yet they're still training people now via their Jedi Academy to be these professionals in the future. So a lot of what's happening now in terms of sharing knowledge between these two different fields is something that's still very much in progress. So even people that are, professionals at it, whether they're people that used to work in games, using Unreal, let's say, they now have a learning curve in order to bring that knowledge into the world of film, because like you said, there's different sorts of standards in terms of the quality that's expected. There's a big sort of focus on the way things are framed or shot or the angles that might be used to sort of tell a story. Whereas in games, it's like usually the user has full control of the camera. So you're not really thinking about how to set things up in space as much, because there's different sorts of people controlling that and different parameters that you have to keep in mind. So there's still a pretty big learning curve, and things are constantly changing. These big companies are developing new pipelines all the time and altering the ones that they have to kind of make it work for film instead of games. So right now, the biggest common skill I would say is being able to pick things up quickly. Being someone who's a problem solver, or someone who is adaptable, is going to be your strongest asset. I know that sounds really vague right now, and it is. And I'll talk a little bit more about some more specific things about virtual production later in the stream. But at the core, it's all about being a problem solver. It's all about being adaptable and being willing to learn new things, because a lot of the software is continuing to be developed. The leaders out there are figuring out new efficiencies. So right now it's all about passing on the knowledge. There's a lot of companies doing workshops to train people. You look at Epic and Unreal, they had a huge grant program to train professionals, people who are already in the industry in high-level positions, to train them on this software. So a lot of it is just about being willing and able. And the big companies still find that there isn't enough people out there who know these skills yet. So
yeah, and to Maxine's point,
challenges.
Everybody, one of the things to keep in mind with all of these industries is that they're all rapidly moving, right? And yeah. All the hardware we're working on, whether it's next generation consoles, if you look at all the consoles that launched last week, and the power that they have, and then if you look at, for example, the demo that came out from Epic a month or two ago with the PS5 and the Unreal Engine 5. That's a set of technology that's not in the hands of most people yet. And it's tough because that's going to be another like generational leap forward in technology and production processes and pipelines. Like everything's going to change, and that's going to throw all of these industries that we're talking about today, the game industry, the film industry, all these industries that use the Unreal Engine are going to have massive, massive changes when it comes to using UE5. It is a very fundamental shift in production process and pipelines. And so that's what scares us the most right now, is that even how we look, if you look at the demo, I should have had it up just to reinforce those of you who haven't seen it, to go look at that UE5 demo on YouTube. It's absolutely mind-blowing, the quality of how photorealistic these things can be, right? And so the amount and how we build those assets at the scale that they have and the time we have and the budget we have scares us all to death, right? And so to Maxine's point, we are all, like across the board in the next, 6 months or a year, if we're staying bleeding edge, maybe in the next 2 years, we are all going to have to retrain. We are all going to have to figure this out, because it's going to be a huge shift, right? And so if you can't have that nimbleness to figure out how to really adapt and learn new things constantly in this industry, that's going to be probably your first sign of death, in your job and your career, is if you're sticking with older engines or older technologies. That doesn't mean that there won't still be companies around for 5 years using the equivalent of UE4 and current today's progress. Some companies may be slow to change, or they may have an existing product that they don't update. So it doesn't mean that if you only know UE4 today that you won't be able to get a job in 6 months. Not everybody's going to shift day one, but again, you got to be ready and be willing to learn, constantly in this industry, and that's definitely, very critical.
Mm-hmm.
And so now talking about, game designers, what skill sets, are kind of transferring over. And so again, like I talked about earlier, to me, there's, you're building a software product in most of these companies, right? You're building just a piece of software. And if you abstract it out from games, games are just an elaborate piece of software, right? And yes, we have stories, or we have things that maybe other products don't have in them. But that doesn't mean that we're any less complicated or whatever than any kind of, whether you're talking about Microsoft Word to, anything else like that. Building a traditional software product is still a very similar process to building a game, right? But games just have a lot more to them, right? And so that's something that I want you guys to understand as a designer again, right? Take that game out of it. But as a designer, building a software product really has a lot of the same things that you have to understand. You have to understand what user experiences are. What is that? Who is that user going to be? Is that user might be anybody in the world. It might be kids. It might be, the military, like hardcore special forces guys. It might be, some other government agency that, has a very specific thing. It might be, some other user group, right? And so just like in games, you have to kind of know, like, who is this target audience, right? Am I trying to make a hyper casual mobile game that's going to be appealing to 2 billion people? Or am I making this very, niche, like, math education game or educational thing for young kids, right? We have to know our users, and we have to understand our users, and we have to do the research to kind of understand, like, what do those users like? What do they need? How hardcore is this thing versus how casual is this thing, right? And so as a game designer, that's one of our most important skills in general, is understand our users and constantly trying to adapt all of our game ideas, especially our user interfaces and things like that, to really be strongly appealing to those users. And then the next thing is just in game design, and this is where I think one of the key things to as we get into the jobs and talk about it, that where we have an edge. This is one of the areas. So there's lots of people in traditional software that understand user experiences, but what they don't understand is how to make it fun, and therefore how to make it engaging and addicting, right? And so how do we deal with retention, for example? How do we get players and kids especially, but this really applies to anybody. I don't care whether you're 5 or you're 50. If you're getting into a game, right? It's like, how is this interesting? Why do I want to play this? And then why do I want to keep coming back and coming back and coming back and like keep playing this thing for long periods of time and just getting people interested in that product? And so I don't care whether you're making an educational product or if you're making a simulation or whatever it is you're making. If that thing is not fun, if that thing is not interesting, if that's not exciting to play, then you've kind of you've instantly lost kind of that battle, right? And that people don't want to necessarily play it. And this is especially true with educational stuff or corporate training things or whatever. You might tell somebody, hey, you have to go play this. You have to go use this application. And they're going to go kicking and screaming and not want to go into it, right? Because they're frustrated that they're playing this thing they don't want to play, right? Or they're using this thing and they just see it as a burden. But if you as a game designer can get in there and make that fun and make it just as fun as a video game, you'll see that a lot of these areas, while that may not be applicable to every area in these jobs we talk about, that's one of our edges. That's one of the things that when I go in there and deal with these other types of companies that are non-game companies, the first thing they look at me is like, how do we make this engaging, right? How do we really do this so that people want to use it, right? And from the minute they boot it up to that whole experience, that's one of our like special skills that we have as game designers that more traditional software designers and other people don't have. They have not been trained kind of in that same level of user engagement and fun, right? And so again, that may not be applicable to all these jobs, but it's definitely a really core skill that sets us apart. And that's something to not overlook as far as why should they hire you versus some other guy down the street who's been building, apps in that same industry or something. There's a good sell you can have there to sell yourself to say, look, I know how to make things fun and engaging and keep people really wanting to use this, and understand that in a special way. And there's a lot of logic there that companies realize that you're right in the end, that is a special skill of game designers compared to more, I'll call them academics or other types of traditional corporate type designers that don't think in the same way that we do as game designers. And that really is our special skills and special sauce, in a lot of ways.
That's so true. That's it. I just want to agree.
Yep. Maxine, feel free to jump in here at any time.
Engaging is like the more professional or corporate way of saying fun. I like that. I make engaging content. Sounds a lot more professional than saying like I make things fun.
No, and it really is true. And like I said, I can't undersell that. That again, there's been a lot of people that are kind of like, hey, that you get again can be stereotyped or be put into a thing of like, oh, but you're a game designer. Like, what do you know about this or whatever? And the other skill set, which I didn't really necessarily put on here, but it's back to what you talked about, Maxine, where you have to constantly learn, right? And so as game designers, we have to learn every day. Now that could be about game development, how to be a better game designer, but a lot of what we have to learn is that every single project that we do, usually, not always, but is often a different topic. So for example, when I did Rainbow Six Vegas, I had to learn everything about military and special forces. And while I already knew a lot about that, if you look at my bookshelf, and you've probably heard through my live streams before and seen, the hundreds of books that I had to read and all the movies I watched and all the stuff, the research and the reference that I did to understand that subject, every time we do a new project, we have to become subject matter experts typically in that area, right? So I don't care whether I'm going to go do something in the medical field or the education field or whatever it is that's related to this. It's that same idea that, yes, I'm not going to be a subject matter expert day one in that, but I have the skill sets to go learn it and learn it quickly and deeply, and I know how to do that. And surprisingly, that's a skill set that a lot of people don't have. A lot of people that have been in the same job for a very long time have gotten very this is my job, this is what I do, I know everything. They've become kind of complacent, and it's harder for them to get in and learn. And I think as game designers especially, we have that special skill set of really knowing how to dive into something quickly, learn it, and then be able to get up to speed on kind of a new subject, and then boom, we're like experts in it very quickly. And that's also can be helpful. And so that's where I can learn what I don't know, very fast. And that's something that that's a skill I use definitely a lot, especially when I'm going into non-traditional, game roles. The next thing is talking about gamification. Gamification, if you guys don't know about it, you definitely, that's something I should probably do a live stream on because it's a whole topic in and of itself, but it's basically this idea of, again, it kind of relates back to engaging and addicting, but applying it into other areas that are not games, right? And so for example, rewards programs. If you think about airlines rewards programs, and you get miles for flying, and you can turn those miles in for points that could be used for upgrades and flights and free stuff, whatever. And then you're getting badges, and you're getting little things of like status levels, right? And you're getting all these things. So whether these are in the physical world, like airlines use them or whatever, or if they're, or even going to your grocery stores and things like that have all these rewards programs, to pure digital gamification and just earning badges and rewards and levels and, things like that. That whole system of again, how to make it kind of addicting, how to get people in there who are casual players and learn, how do I reward them? How do I get them in here? How do I get them again playing it and then keeping them in there and giving them these little things that keep them every day wanting to play or wanting to come back to it, right? That's something that as game designers, we either directly or indirectly understand gamification very well. And so there is people in the corporate world that try to utilize gamification. They try to understand it, but they're not game designers. Game designers really, this is something we know really well, right? And so again, this is an area and a skill set that we can bring in and really, every time I've had a conversation with somebody from the corporate world about gamification, I've, in all honesty, blown them away. They didn't know even 1% of what I knew on that topic. They kind of read a few books and sort of understood it, but they really don't know it at the depth that we do as game designers. So that's a huge skill set that you can bring over because it's applicable into pretty much every area of non-traditional games. And again, it could even be, American Airlines or something that you're working with there. So gamification is actually a whole job category sort of in and of itself that's applicable into a lot of things. And so there is people I know that their whole job is just experts in gamification, and people hire them even as consultants just in gamification. So just as a quick aside, that is even almost its own job category at some levels. And we talked about problem solving, but again, this is being able to problem solve as a game designer and be able to go in there and look at problems and solve them and fix them at any level is really an important skill set that we do. It's always about finding that balance, whether it's from the technology side, we've got a limited amount of technology, or our hardware platform can only do this, or we only have this much budget and this much time. So that's the kind of problem solving that we as game designers are used to doing. We're always compromising. We're always trying to figure out how to build the best product we have in the time we have. And so don't underestimate your skills of how you can problem solve, again, to make a great software program or software product, because that's, again, that skill set that's really important to go in there and understand it. Next, all of just our interface design skills. That's definitely something that a lot of your more corporate types or other industries really lack, and they really don't understand, again, how to make things engaging. There is UX people out there that are pretty good, whether you go to Apple or whatever. But again, they don't necessarily know. They're used to doing UX on like websites and things like that. They're not necessarily in the same area where they could go into, say, a military simulator, and do the UX and the interface design for that, right? And so again, as game designers, we've got, a lot of skills there that are very transferable. And really, there's just, again, I would say that 90% of your skill sets as a game designer are going to transfer over. The things that probably won't might be things like storytelling, or world building, or, character designs, maybe, or stuff that's more, fantasy or whatever, but that still doesn't mean that you can't build a fantasy game. Like if you look at some educational games to teach kids, right? They still are in a fantasy world. They're still in, a make-believe setting and things like that. So not everything is going to be real world, so your skill set of building fantasy worlds or things like that we've learned in games can still be very, very applicable into non-gaming, areas. So I think that's important to understand. So, Maxine, do you have anything to add on kind of skill sets and things before we move on?
No. I'm good. Just no.
All right. So, kind of, excuse the bad PowerPoints again. I always do a horrible job on these, so I always
Mine
feel
are the
embarrassed
same.
to show off my PowerPoints, but it is what it is.
Mine are like all text. It's very boring. It's just me chatting most of the time.
Yeah.
People like it though. People seem to be into that.
I don't get a lot of time to prep for these things, and so it's always just we slam something together. But so what I want to do is kind of go through each of these and kind of talk about how, again, the skill sets are kind of applicable and how they apply. So Maxine, please jump in at any time, with your stuff. Thanks, Rushback.
They like our boring PowerPoint.
They like my boring, horrible.
Yeah, my
things.
classes are similar, but
someday I'll show you guys my real PowerPoints that I make for like real presentations, so that you can be impressed with my skills. I know you guys are probably laughing at me right now. You're like, God, this guy sucks. He's horrible. Like, what does he do?
Hey, I didn't make it any better, so we're in it together now, Troy.
I do have some skills. Not. I'm not masterful in my PowerPoints, but I got a few skills there.
As long as you know enough to be able to get your point across. That's what it's all about, right?
Exactly.
Like, yeah, you can make a beautiful PowerPoint, but if you get your point across with something like this, then that's fine too, right?
Yep.
That's like the basis of PowerPoints are serious business, right, Mattia?
Yep. I like big blocks.
It's about getting your point across to like what you're trying to do.
Anyways.
Yeah.
I'm going to be narcissistic about this.
True.
It's all about me.
Oh my God. All the people in your stream, all the regulars are so nice.
Yeah. I got some awesome people that follow me every week. So,
it's a good
let's go through kind of each category. And again, we'll just kind of talk about each kind of generalized job, area. And then Maxine, please jump in on any of these that you know about and have, any insight into. Totally. And again, I'll try to kind of talk about how the skill sets apply or don't apply, things like that. So now VR AR is kind of a very, very, very generalized category, meaning that any of these things really could be VR and AR. So really VR and AR is a kind of almost a subcategory, and really, as you know, is a technology category. But I listed out specifically because it is kind of a different skill set that people are looking for, and people in games have been doing a lot more VR, AR stuff than a lot of other areas. So if you have worked in VR and AR and understand the differences of those, there's a lot of applicability into kind of all these areas. I think I would say the vast majority of these different jobs that we're going to talk about today all have subcategories of groups within them that are trying to use VR and AR in them to accomplish different goals. Some of those may be trendy, and some of those may be things that kind of come and go. Again, it's a hardware platform, right? And VR and AR is changing by the hour, and it keeps changing, and it's kind of a roller coaster ride of popularity and fads to stuff. But I do believe that my personal opinion on VR especially is that in games, I still think it's a fad. I think we're still, if you look at the sales numbers, if you look at how many people are buying them, if I remember right, the number one VR game right now is Alexi from Valve, which was one of the Half-Life VR games. And I think they had about 1 million downloads or 1 million sales. And while that's okay, it's nothing like the 75 million downloads or players that you're going to get through some of these other more traditional games and stuff, right? And so even the biggest VR product is still light years away from other traditional games and success, right? And especially in an industry where you really want to have like 10 million downloads to be considered successful these days. And so they're only getting like 10% of that, to be successful. So for me, VR in games has been kind of a failure. That doesn't mean that it won't change in 3 to 5 years, but right now the technology is not quite there, and it's starting to go better with wireless headsets and stuff. But again, it's not been great. However, in a lot of these other non-gaming areas, VR has actually taken off in huge ways. So a lot of the corporate enterprise level type stuff or educational type stuff actually makes a lot more sense in VR. And then now AR as well is starting to come on and also have a lot of applications into these things, which we'll kind of talk about. So keep that in mind, that if you have skills in VR and AR and really understand that, if you've worked in that as a game designer or whatever, there's a lot of very subtle differences. Just to give you a quick example of things we've learned, I did this game called Dying Reborn, and it was on the PS3 and PSVR, and it was a puzzle game. And so there was a VR version and a non-VR version of the game. But in the VR version, we quickly realized with the headset on that most people were not looking up. And as we were doing focus tests, we realized that people were scanning this way, back and forth and looking down, but very few of them actually looked up. And we had a lot of puzzles that were up on the ceilings and things like that. And in VR, people weren't seeing them. And so we were getting like horrible test results, in VR because people weren't getting the puzzles right. So we had to redesign all of our puzzles, and bring them all down kind of into player viewpoints, here, so that they didn't have to like crane their neck up with that heavy visor on. So that's just one example of many different skill sets that as a game designer, we learned, how do people interact in VR and how they do things that are different. And that same lesson learned there would be applicable into all of these areas and all of these other jobs. So that's just kind of one example of how the skill sets can transfer over there. And again, to me, a hardware platform is a hardware platform. And I've gone through now, even on the console side, I think this platform now is my 7th or 8th now as a developer that I've gone through. And so, you begin to kind of see the trends and understand that every hardware platform it all has kind of the same problems each time, and they're not unique. And so again, no matter what and the reason why that's important to understand is, again, we've learned that we constantly adapt, we constantly learn again. And so these hardware platforms, whether you're going to go into a military simulator that's super proprietary and can be using like, the fastest computer in the world, right? That's just another hardware platform. And you have to design for that and understand what that platform needs. But you also could be designing on a super slow little custom embedded device or something else. So you might have 100 more hardware platforms throughout all these different worlds that we're going to talk about today in these jobs. So as a game designer, it's really just about, like we always do, learning how to get the best out of what we got, right? And part of that is the skill set of just learning how to fake things and how to do things as kind of smoke and mirrors versus doing things very realistically. And so we have to understand that that's where a lot of these jobs can get into trouble, or where a lot of people have problems in some of these jobs. It's sometimes the accuracy of these things. They try to, for example, especially in education and teaching, try to be more exact, more precise. They try to be more like a simulator where things have to be very accurate. And that's not necessarily true. There's times and places where learning and education need to be very accurate. And there's times where it just needs to be fun and engaging so that the kids or whoever are learning the right way. And so don't assume that, an educational game has to be a simulation, right? And so with that comes a lot of, again, performance understanding, and understanding what's the right thing to have in your product, right? And understanding what's right for your audience. So the first really big area that I think is the most obvious is just in education and educational games. And there's a lot of different labels in this. These could be games that are obviously for children or to adults. They can be things that are teaching anything from math and science and, all of your STEM and STEAM type topics, and be things that are like super understood as being, in education, or these things could be more like subtle, where we're teaching a lot of like corporate training. I'm kind of going to combine these first two together: education, teaching, educational, and serious games together, because they're all sort of related, but they're slightly different fields in that it's all about, they're all, things about just players going into potentially and using a game or often gamification or other kinds of related things to go in there and get people to learn. Right. But the most important thing, like I mentioned and referenced earlier, is if the kids especially don't want to learn, if you're throwing this thing at them and saying, here, use this stupid thing, and it's really boring and it really is horrible to play and you're going to be miserable the whole time you're playing it, but go play it, 5 hours a day because you have to, they're not going to want to do that. Right. And, for a long time, for example, my friend's son, he would always want to play video games. And, and it was funny because he was so just obsessed, like most kids are, with just wanting to play video games. And my friend was very smart, and she would make him earn time, to play video games, but he would have to play these educational games. But we never called them educational games. We would just say like, well, you have to go play this game for an hour. And if you play that game for an hour, then you can play Minecraft or you can play whatever it was. And in his mind, it was just a game. And so he was like, he would happily go in there and play these educational games for hours. And actually, and then he started asking to play for those kinds of games. And he actually enjoyed playing them because he just, in his mind, thought of them as a video game. And so that same kind of addiction, that same sort of thing happened. And pretty soon he was playing that stuff on his own. And we didn't have to force it on him at all. But that was almost a semantical thing as a parent to say like, no, go play this game. This thing's really fun. And it came across as a game. It felt like a game. It held all the things that a game had. And so the kid would just play it for long periods of time and without complaining, right? And they actually wanted to play that thing. And so that's the kind of stuff that, as a game designer, especially, we have an edge in education, right? We have a way of wanting the kids to kind of play these things, and anybody. And again, I don't care whether you're a 50-year-old that's retraining to get into a new job or something like that. Again, these things need to be fun, interesting, so that you can really, figure out how to play them. And, and these things could be, corporate training stuff. They could be ways of, for example, I've seen lots of stuff that are designed to, put people into a virtual world, and let them interact in a world and put them into like dangerous situations even. For example, I've seen things where you could take through VR or just in a normal non-VR game, could go into like a nuclear reactor. You'd have to go in and figure out where there was a problem and then figure out how to fix it and stuff. And so they could put the people into hazardous situations through this training simulator or this training game, that allowed them to go somewhere and do something that they couldn't do in the real world, right? And that was something that was pretty exciting, that allowed them to train them safely, versus just putting them into a hazardous situation, right? And so that was a perfect example of like being able to do something there that was unique, and kind of related to games. Likewise, I did some consulting back after 9/11, and I was consulting for some government agencies that I still can't talk about. But hopefully they're not listening. But we were developing some stuff that was working to teach doctors how to deal with terrorist attacks. And one of the problems they were having was that textbooks and things like that were very linear. And so when you'd read about something in a textbook, it was really hard to be like, well, if the terrorists do this or if they do that, or, and creating that randomization and that stuff of uniqueness so that every time, when they read the book or whatever, which was how they were training beforehand, that the doctors were failing, even very smart doctors were failing out of these exams that were trying to teach them how to deal with this stuff. And so we actually created a computer game or training simulator that would allow these doctors to go into these situations, and it would randomize their stuff, just kind of like a video game. We'd use AI and we'd use these things. And so the doctors didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what was going to happen. And it taught them to think. It taught them how to use their brains and how to assess situations, because it was always going to be different. And their success rates jumped to like 70 to 80% on average after playing that simulator versus just having read it in a book. And so that was a perfect example of, again, my knowledge of video games and AI and how to build, virtual worlds and things like that really became, a great way to kind of create these, we'll call them corporate training, but that, that's a very broad bucket of lots of things, out there. And also, just for what it's worth, like some of these corporate training things, I don't know if I probably can't reveal the budgets that I know about at some of these companies, but for example, there's a really big telecom company that I know of that their budget just for corporate training every year is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and so whereas like in some cases, in some games, we're fighting just to get, a couple $100,000 or $1 million. And like, we're trying just to get these like small budgets scraped together to try to make a game. But yet, in some of these corporate training worlds, they literally can spend hundreds of millions of dollars to train their employees. And so you just got like kind of, again, that more stable environment of like, hey, you've got big budget. They're willing to invest in these things and they're willing to put the money into these things.
Or there's a lot of companies that aren't even using their budget.
Oh,
that's
yeah. No, they have
too. Like they have this budget to use for education and training. And then end of the year comes and maybe they got a subscription to some tutorial site and like that's it. And then there's like thousands of dollars that could have been used for people to get more specific training in their jobs or their roles, and they didn't use it. So that's another like weird thing or kind of problem you see in the industry is like not taking advantage of,
well, they don't know how.
They have.
The problem is they just don't know how, and they don't have game designers on staff that could tell them like, hey, here's how I could create this virtual world or this other thing and create this interactive experience and make it fun and compelling. And that they don't know our world at all, so they don't even know where to start. And that's the problem is they just don't even know. And then they may go talk to like a more academic type person. And sorry if I'm bagging on academics today, but they don't know academics that come from the schools and stuff. 95% of them do not know how to make a product, right? They're very theoretical and things like that. And this has been a problem in that a lot of, especially in this education world, a lot of the people that get into making these products are actually academics and they don't come from a real production background. And so they know the theory, they know conceptually like how to build something, but they really don't know how to make a game and an interactive experience the way we do. And so 9 times out of 10, we can run circles around them because we really know how to make a great product versus they can theorize on how to make something that's great. And putting the two of us together is kind of that perfect world because they may understand the subject better. They may know how to teach better. They may know how learning theories work and things like that. To train somebody in a better way, but they don't know how to make a great user experience and make a great product in the end. How to use Unreal and how to like optimize for it and things like that. And so every time I've worked with academics, they've always failed. And I've never been on a successful product that was driven by a bunch of people that came out of an academic world because, again, they didn't have the experience. And so you have to be kind of careful there. But again, this is where our skill sets can complement them. But Maxine, to your point, that's the problem is a lot of these corporate companies go to the more academic types because they're the ones specializing in the corporate training or education and whatever. And then a lot of them don't really truly know like how to make a great product, right? And that's where I've seen the failures over and over and over again, And so that's it. It's kind of sad, but that's the harsh truth, and that they just don't have that experience that we do, in building product. And lastly, like another example of like things I've built, I did a project for HP some years ago. They had these devices that were designed for test, and each one of these test devices was like a little rack-mounted machine. It was nothing fancy, but every one of them was $1 million a piece to have. And so for training purposes, like they had to have these $1 million machines for each student to work on, right? And so their classrooms would have hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment in it just to do training, and it was killing them. And then of course every time there was a change, they had to update it all. It was absolutely killing them on their training side. So I actually designed a virtual like simulator that was 100% accurate. It used all their math, it used all their stuff exactly the same from that thing. You could click on every button and operate every button exactly the same as you would the real device, and it was perfectly accurate. But it was 100% software, and basically, then from then on was free. right? And we could update it very quickly and that kind of thing. So that's another example of like, it didn't take a lot of game design experience because it was more of a simulator, but it again was an education thing that HP used in its education office that ultimately, was something that was interactive, and playable there. So it's just, again, you'd be surprised like how many opportunities like that are out there, how many things out there that you can do. So next, let's talk about architecture. I've done a little bit of work in this where, you can create things in VR, you can create things just on a computer, but being able to previs something, this is kind of similar to what Maxine and the previs and the movie side of stuff, but it's the same idea that we can create, hotel, like I've created hotels and I've created houses in full 3D worlds that I could basically walk around in and interact with so that we could test things before, and look at things. And some of that's artistic where I want to just walk around and look at something from all 3D angles versus looking at, something 2D. But if you take it farther, there's a lot of things you can do in architecture to make it interactive that allow you to make something more understandable, right? And that could be something that's a commercial retail product, or this could be something that's just used internally, corporate-wise, for training purposes or understanding it or visualizing things. But as like an example, I did a project for Hyatt hotels some years ago. There was an internal project that we built. It was a new hotel that was unbuilt. They just had the concept and the floor plans and the stuff to go into Macau to build this new hotel. And it was a hotel casino. And they wanted to understand what the users, because when a typical user in a real hotel walks through the front door, they don't know what you do. They don't know if you go get food. They don't know if you gamble. They don't know if you go to your room or to the pool. Like they have no way of tracking you, right? And so they were trying to study users and what they did so they could optimize the user experience, but they had no way of tracking users in real hotels. And so they basically had us create this virtual architectural simulator that would allow people to go experience the hotel in VR. And while it wasn't a perfect one-to-one, it still was an interesting concept that they wanted to test out to see if they could try to understand what people did when they entered these hotel casino complexes, right? And where they were spending their time and money and those kinds of things.
First point of contact and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so I'm just using that as one example of some projects I've done, that use architectural, my skills as a game designer and as a software developer more than just a pre-visualization tool. Because I think architecture might be 80% previs right now, meaning that you just build something so you can walk around and see it. But that doesn't mean that, again, we can't take it to the next level and add interactivity to it, which is what game designers do, right? And so, but especially if you're an artist, there is a lot of architectural firms that really are investing heavily in visualizing their stuff in 3D and creating even more and more. Like, the architects used to build traditional models even, to build out and try to show the building or city or whatever the house that they're building. And, they literally build all these physical models, and that's all transitioning now to a lot of digital stuff, and they want to, again, see and visualize their projects in 3D and fly around them and stuff like that. So if you're an artist and you're into especially architectural design and architecture just in general, or if you're in games and do that stuff, there is a lot of opportunity still in the architectural world to do the previs stuff that may or may not be interactive. So, or it could just be general fly-throughs or walkthroughs, and stuff. So, and sometimes just even rendered. Next is simulation. So simulation can be related to education, but there's a lot of, again, kind of like VR, AR, simulation's a little bit bigger field in that all of these areas could have some aspects of being a simulation versus a game. And really, to summarize the differences, a simulator typically is more accurate. A simulator is something that's simulating, reality. And so, for example, in a game, if I'm shooting a gun, I might just have, a basic thing where every time I pull the trigger, there's some percentage chance that the other guy's going to get hit, and it's just kind of faked. It's not actually calculating the real ballistics of my bullet. It just says I pull the trigger, and I've got some chance of maybe doing, high damage or normal damage, so those kinds of things as a game designer, we often fake. Whereas in a simulator, you would want to track each bullet, its velocity, the wind, and at some levels of accuracy, how many feet per second that bullet's moving and all the ballistics and all that kind of stuff. And so you get in the weeds of like hyper accuracy. And that's one area that as a game designer, we struggle sometimes, to be honest, when we move into simulation, because we're so used to faking it that we don't necessarily understand how to really make something work that's hyper accurate. And so I've had that struggle a few times on some military simulators that I worked on, where they really, the level of accuracy that they needed in their software application was literally 100x what the accuracy I was using in my games were, right? And so I had to do a lot of relearning and rethinking about stuff and how do we design it, because it had to be so accurate, so realistic, right? Because realistic is not always fun. And that's the challenge we have here. So if you're a game designer and you're moving to simulation, just be aware of that, that your skill set will mostly transfer over, but you have to understand that simulation often needs a lot more high level of accuracy. But the reverse can always be true as well. I'll tell a funny story of when I was at Microsoft and working on the Xbox. We had a third-party developer that was making a Civil War era game, and they had 10,000 troops versus 10,000 troops, and they had all these troops going towards each other fighting, and they were working on this game for a long, long time, and they were only getting 1 or 2 frames per second. The game was running really, really slow. And if you don't know, you need to be at a minimum of 30 frames per second. You really need to be at 60 frames per second on a game. So they were running at 1 or 2. They were not passable. They would not be something that, that Microsoft would have passed to allow them on the Xbox. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And so they brought the build to us. And so myself and another guy who was an engineer, had a look at it, and about 30 minutes later, we came back out and we showed them the game running about 200 frames per second. And they couldn't figure out, they're like, we've been trying for months to get the game to run fast. Like, how did you guys get it going like literally 200 times faster in 30 minutes? And I told them they were simulating 10,000 bullets on each side. So they had 20,000 bullets. Every time somebody shot, they were tracking the trajectories, the ballistics, all this stuff super accurately, like it was a simulation, and they were doing all this stuff, and they were figuring out where in the body that the bullet would hit and what kind of damage it would do and whether that would kill the person. And when you're doing that 20,000 times per frame, it was just bringing your game down to its knees, and it wasn't fun. And it literally couldn't even run. And all we did was replace it with, these guys shot and had some percentage number of guys they would kill, and these guys shot and had some percentage chance, and that percentage was based on some stats that group of units had, and it literally took us 30 minutes to change that and put in basically a random dice roll for all intents and purposes. You could not tell the difference in the gameplay at all. They thought it was doing the same simulation as before, so the user experience was exactly the same. We just took out the accuracy, right? And so that's that reverse, again, of understanding as a game designer how to make something fun, and we kind of fake it. But then, if you're actually doing a simulator, you may have to track those 20,000 bullets and figure out how to make that work. And that's where it gets tricky, because we're not necessarily used to working at that level of accuracy. And so it definitely has made my life difficult on some projects. But again, in simulation, there's lots and lots and lots of areas that could be in corporate areas, that could be, in medical, they could be in military, all sorts of different kind of sub areas that require accuracy and want to simulate something. Even a lot of corporate training, like even the stuff I talked about with the going into a nuclear reactor, like that could be a very casual experience, or that could be a simulator, right? It just depends on how accurate does that customer want it for their users, right? Is their users trying to really super accurately like model like the radiation levels and all these kinds of things that are in the reactor, or is it just kind of like more about the experience of going in and learning like the layout of a reactor and what to do and the order of things and what to do it in and things like that? So what are you trying to teach, and how accurate do you need to be? How much simulation versus how much game do you need to be? And that's, again, our ability to think through and problem solve is what's needed there to try to understand those things. And simulation can also get into kind of, again, in corporate training, especially things where in that same nuclear reactor simulator, they actually have stuff where you have to go up and fix a machine, and that machine would break, and then you'd have to go in there and try to figure out what was broken, and you'd use all this equipment, and all these different things to try to figure out which part was broken and figure out how to fix it. And that was so again, kind of a simulator, in that you're repairing this thing. And then what I thought was really cool was they then built an AR version of that. And so they actually designed something whereas they realized that the experts in a lot of these machines are like halfway around the world. The company that built these machines was literally, around the world, and they didn't have enough, cost or manpower or whatever to put all these experts to fix these things, all around the globe, right? So they could have rapid response times. So what they built were AR headsets that literally anybody could go in, put this headset on, and there was a video connector to it. So the guy could be halfway around the world. He'd be seeing the live video feed of what you were doing. And the AR would understand things. And so if you went up to, say, a machine to fix it, it'd actually do an AR overlay, and you'd see little arrows and tell you, okay, step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. And a guy on video could be watching you and correcting you. And so they created this whole simulator, of how to fix a machine in real time, but something that, you or I that have no experience on that machine using it could actually go in and repair it. So that was another good example of how, again, they built an AR application that was basically a video game for all intents and purposes and a simulator, but built it into AR and created a very interesting thing that allowed, and solved a big problem for them. So again, most of the same skills used to develop that app are almost the same skills that we'd use to design a game and build a game. Now, for medical and healthcare, I think this is probably one of the biggest areas. Education and medical healthcare are probably the two biggest areas right now that exist, I think, where our skills where they're hiring a lot of like game designer types in there. And in fact, over even just the last couple of years, I've been approached by, I think, three companies that were all actually ex-game designers, game developers, and they've built medical companies now, and they're actually building medical simulators of various types that were, going in and things that would like let you fly through the human body and do things inside of it, and they're doing all kinds of different types of medical things, and they actually, some of them have even got like FDA approval and things like that, where they're being recognized now as being very helpful and actually useful in a lot of areas. For example, in psychology, they're using, and they've been doing this even for like 20 years. One of my best friends in college was even doing this 20 years ago in VR, where they'd put on a headset, for example, and somebody who had like a phobia, like he had one with snakes. And, when the person would first put on the VR headset, which was very immersive, the snake would be maybe 100 meters away. And then slowly at each session, the snake would come in closer and closer and closer, and it would help them desensitize towards that. He also did things where they had like driving simulators, people that were afraid of driving. He'd have like a full like race car simulator that was basically a video game, car driving game, but he would hook people up to that, put them in VR, and people that were scared of driving, and they could learn to drive in a safe environment, and then desensitized again towards that fear that they were having in driving. He also built one for people that were afraid of heights, where he built this rickety rope bridge, but in reality it was only about 6 inches off the ground. But when you were in VR and you were using it, it would look like, initially maybe you were 6 inches or a foot, but in each session you get higher and higher and higher, so pretty soon you were looking 100 meters down, and so people that were afraid of height, that would help them do that. So there's lots of ways to use, stuff for medical purposes, and those could be, very, very precise, like VR, AR surgery, I would put kind of into the simulation category. There's a lot of things that are being used again to teach doctors like how to do surgeries, and they're even creating, I was at a conference last year, and they had all these even like mechanical arms that they had like hooked up, and they could actually have like a scalpel and things like that, and be going in and be seeing this thing in VR and be like literally like cutting things and doing surgeries in full virtual reality. And that's the kind of stuff that, it's kind of hard to practice, when you don't want to have to work on a real person, right? And working on cadavers and stuff only got you so far. So that's been a huge area that I've seen a massive explosion in stuff that teaches surgeons and things like that, like how to do stuff. And they've created all kinds of secondary devices even that allow those surgeons to do these virtual surgeries in a more accurate way and really see them and understand them. So that's a huge area. Same thing, sports medicine and training. They're doing all kinds of apps like that can like even do real-time body tracking and things. And they're, checking range of motion in the game, and that simulator can track and see how you're moving, and and be able to evaluate, see you're throwing and things like that. And again, they're creating these fun kind of games and these training things. Same thing like if you ever played like Wii Sports, right? And you had these motion controllers, and we were doing fun things, we were doing stuff. They're using that idea to the next generation, where you can use motion controls and things like that to help people's health, to help them understand how athletes train and things like that. But they're using very sophisticated technology. But again, it's not all that different than Wii Sports and really what they're building. So again, that's how that translation of skill sets sort of works. We talked about gamification already, but I'll just kind of reinforce again, this is kind of another one of those subcategories of stuff, kind of like simulation and VR that can be used in a lot of different areas. But the concept of making things addictive and making things, appealing to people at all levels is really applicable to all of these different jobs. Also, if you've been in mobile game design, the skill sets that we learn about how to just design mobile apps, especially the monetization, user acquisition, anything related to like mobile development, it's its own little niche. It's its own little world. And if you've learned how to make a mobile game, a significant amount of learning how to be a great mobile game designer is learning about that monetization, user acquisition, these other areas that are not necessarily game design. That's what makes being a mobile game designer really hard. But all of that knowledge transfers 100% over into mobile application development. So not necessarily mobile games, but just mobile apps in general and stuff. And so you'll find that there's a lot of similarities there. Likewise, especially if you do mobile game design and do user interface, UI, UX, all of that skill set, again, is extremely applicable into just general mobile application design and development. And that's another area that, there's a lot of crossover. And again, it's about how, in mobile game design, it's about how to make things super addictive as fast as possible, right? And so that's the same thing with mobile apps. Games are more so, but mobile apps, again, need to, you got to be able to pick this thing up and enjoy it in 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Otherwise, the person just goes next, and they uninstall you. And that's the reality of mobile application design or mobile game design. So it's its own little niche. So Maxine, anything to add? Well,
really just education. That's such a big one now. Just gonna throw the lens of COVID and the pandemic onto it, because people love hearing about that. But I think that there are so many educators and teachers out there now that are being forced into this online space that never got the training to work online before. So now all of a sudden we have these people that are, working in an online space that might not know how to do that properly. Maybe they know how to be engaging in a classroom, especially with younger children. It's easy to get their engagement when they're looking at you and when there's less distractions in the room. But if they're, learning your class on an iPad or on their home computer, you can't control what's happening around them in their own home space. So making, your learning material more engaging is really important. So I think there's a lot of teachers out there who could use help. So if you're, trying to figure out what you can do and how you can use these skills now, especially if you're entry level and you're trying to get that job in the future, working with different teachers. Maybe you have some high school friends who are teachers now. Maybe you have some, family or friends and family that you could talk to who work in this. Maybe they need help. Maybe there's something that you could do to offer support for what they're doing now. And it could be great experience, even if it's unpaid, even if it's doing some volunteer work for a school, it's still something that could count really positively towards your experience in your resume and the jobs in the future. So.
Yeah. And I have to say that I think in general, there is I think COVID has amplified this a lot for us, but in general, I've seen a trend the last kind of 5 years that education in general, especially higher education, are looking for new ways to teach people, and they understand the value of games. We've done a lot of studies in games. And I won't go down a rabbit hole here, but it's been shown that learning through interaction is literally 10x to 100x more engaging. People will learn significantly better through an interactive product than they will through a book or through a teacher, talking to them, or through a video or things like that. And so learning through interaction is definitely something everybody understands that is significantly better. Now the problem is it's very expensive to make interactive products. So making video games and making things like that is very hard and very expensive. And so they haven't resolved that problem yet. And I had a company some years ago that was working on actually building, using kind of MMO technology. We wanted to be able to build the equivalent of an educational MMORPG. And ultimately, we met with a lot of schools. We had a prototype, and we had things where, if you think about a game like Assassin's Creed, for example, we wanted to build a educational version, which the latest Assassin's Creed actually had, or the one, I guess the newest one doesn't, but the one before had a slightly educational version. But we wanted to take that on steroids, where we could immerse students in a virtual world and allow them to go in with their classmates even and go play through these virtual worlds and experience these worlds, experience the battles, fight through these battles and stuff, versus just read about it, versus just watch a movie like Braveheart or something. We were starting with history, but we also had stuff with science and other things where you could go in and do experiments with some famous physicist or some famous scientist, and you could immerse the students in these worlds. And the schools were really excited about doing it, but the problem was, in the end, we had to create so much content that our initial first pass of the project was going to be like $100 million, and there was just no way that was going to get funded, and we couldn't figure out how to make it. So even though everybody wanted it, it was not something that was feasible or financially feasible to do yet. But that's just an example of like, again, using gaming technology. If you think about, if you guys have played Assassin's Creed or know what it is, I mean, everything from how they're dressed and just the if you look at just the outfits or whatever that somebody's wearing and how accurate they are, to how they talk and how they move and what they're eating, and everything in that world that they're doing and they're experiencing can be very realistic, right? Again, maybe it's simulation, maybe it's game, or somewhere in between. But again, every little thing from what they hear to what they see to what they experience can all be something that's very educational, right? And that's where I think there is going to be a lot of companies moving into that type of space. And I know a lot of people are trying to go there. It's just a bit overwhelming because the amount of content you need to teach, say, all of world history or all of U.S. history or something like that is so big that it just becomes cost prohibitive. But again, every year that gets a little cheaper and gets a little bit easier. So people are slowly trying to solve that. All right, let's move on. Since we're running out of time here, we'll kind of try to blow through these a little bit. So we talked about military training simulation. Again, this is a very obvious one, but military is probably one of the bigger people that's investing in everything from like full flight simulators, on the Air Force, and full moving, simulators, all the way down to, green screen rooms with guys with, real guns with these special attachments on that they can go into these virtual worlds and use guns that feel like they're realistic, but they're actually fighting in VR, or they're shooting against these big screens, and stuff like that. So, they've got things that use like lasers and stuff that the gun, when they shoot it, it shoots a little laser, and then they even know if they shot the guy or not. They're creating really crazy simulators. Some of it's all on the computer, some of it's using these other extended devices, but the military is definitely investing very heavily in all kinds of training simulations and all kinds of stuff at all levels. And so there's some very, very fascinating work there. So that's definitely a fun area if you can find the way to do it. And in fact, it's so close to real games that actually a lot of game companies have done actual military simulation games, over the years. Pandemic Studios and some others, that were mainstream game developers actually have done, various simulators, and they created a commercialized version that was for the mainstream public that was a little bit less accurate, a little less simulation, and then they created a military version of the same product that was like super hyper, simulator, super realistic. And so in those cases, they actually did like two products because they recognized that the average consumer, it wasn't as fun, if it was too accurate, right? And they kind of made it more fun, so they got that experience and they learned from it. But there's been a lot of cases where game companies have gotten in and done a lot of military training stuff. And some game companies even have there's a few companies out there that actually, a few game companies that have like two divisions, and one does games and one does simulators and stuff like that. So again, they're closely linked enough that you will see a lot of crossover between military simulation and game development. So, Maxine, off to your topic. Why don't you talk about this next one with movies, TV, and media production?
Well, I think some of my other slides go into more detail, so I'll try to be really quick here about this. But yeah, basically, again, it's all about having a different perspective. So if as a game designer, if there is something you can do to make the content you're creating more engaging, or maybe you can find efficiencies in a pipeline because you have some experience working in games, or developing your own, or having these bigger design ideas and design themes that Troy was talking about, it could really help when you're designing something for a movie, or working on a larger production team for a TV show. Again, it's all about how you can kind of take the information that and the skills that you have and apply it to this new area that you're working in. So movies and TV and any kind of media production, there's so much crossover in terms of skill sets, like when it comes to technical programs and software, but it's really about these other kind of values that you can bring to the table, whether it's being able to learn something new quickly, like what Troy was talking about with his work with the military and Rainbow Six Vegas. It's like being able to adapt to the situation. So it's this new project, and maybe it's a movie based on something military related, being able to adapt to that and being able to tell a story when you're working on this different type of project is going to be key. So I think when it comes to movies and TV production, the executives and the people who are hiring are really looking for people that can innovate, people that can be more efficient in different workflows.
Yeah, and I think especially if you're an artist or such, I think again, if you're a game artist and moving into movies, you might have trouble. Like if you're used to building super low poly characters, moving into movie production is definitely a different world. Now, there's that 80% transference, but there's definitely a slightly different skill set to make a low poly character versus a high poly character, or how you texture it, and using RenderMan or whatever the renderer is in a pre-rendered environment versus real-time environment. However, that being said, I think so much has been changing in the last year, especially with this virtual production stuff, that while we might have had a disadvantage going into a year ago, getting a job as a game designer, a game developer, a game artist in the movie industry, that might have been a leap for some people. Now it's almost an even playing field in my mind, and that the movie guys are trying to figure out Unreal and trying to figure out how to make stuff real time, and so now both worlds are kind of confused, so they're meeting in the middle, and so there's I think a lot more opportunity for game developers to go into virtual production, especially because they're kind of clueless, we're kind of clueless, and we're all trying to figure it out together, right, and figure out how to meet in the middle, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Talking about UI UX design. Again, we talked about this a little bit, but again, especially if you're a game designer or a game UI artist and things like that, there is a lot of opportunity to take those skill sets into other industries. Excuse me. And so don't underestimate the opportunities there's going to be again in all of these different fields as an interface designer, because that's again one of those areas that's very particular about understanding the user experience, especially. And games are no different than any other product. So don't underestimate if you're a really good games UX designer, UI designer. There's definitely a lot of opportunity for you in a lot of different areas, outside of just games. Now, in theme park design, I brought this up because I've actually designed myself 4 theme parks. One in Dubai, one in India, and 2 in China. And I did a lot of the high-level conceptual design on these parks. And people thought, I was crazy. Like, how do you get into like designing theme parks? They see me as a game designer. Now, I do have a background in architecture and construction back from like high school and college days and some things like that I did. So I have a little bit of understanding of physical construction and how that works, but I'm definitely not an architect. But I've also built, a few of my own houses, and I do understand, kind of how floor plans are working and how things are laid out. But conceptually, how you build like an MMORPG, how you build a virtual game world, the rules of how we build that, and again, the user experience of how people flow through a world and where are they going to go and why they're going to go there, and the experiences and the theming, and how to understand how to make this thing really exciting and really cool and stuff like that. is no different, right? It's really a lot of the same skill sets, just applied in a slightly more realistic way. This is more like a simulation, right, versus the game stuff. And so you have to understand that this stuff has to be a little bit more realistic, a little bit more like, okay, yeah, we got some constraints here because we can't do these crazy buildings that defy gravity, right? But, as long as we kind of understand that the buildings we're designing and things like that are fun and cool, and then we can work with potentially an architect or somebody to come in behind us to validate our stuff, is no different than us, designing a virtual world with an engineer or an artist coming in behind us and going like, wait a second, you can't even do that in the virtual world, right? I mean, we always have limitations. We just have to figure out what those limitations are. And then for theme park design, there was just like, again, slightly new things to learn, but a lot of it's common sense. So as a game designer, we've learned how to use our common sense on stuff. So for example, flow rates, like how many people per hour would a ride put through itself? In this one park wanted to have 20,000 people, in the park, but their rides were so slow that you really could have only like maybe ridden one or two rides the whole day, because it just would, the flow rates were like 100 people per hour. Like you can't get 20,000 people a day through that ride, right? So I helped them redesign their rides to cycle faster and go through faster so they could get more people per hour through the rides. And it was funny that they had been designing these rides for years and not thought through the process or the problem of like, how do you get this many people through the park? So for me as a game designer, again, my problem and logic skills is what's, allowed me to do that. And it was just one of those things where, again, they were thinking of their problem in one way, and it just took somebody to be able to come in there and think outside the box, right? And understand the problem and define it, and then quickly learn these new things. And I read some books on theme park design, and stuff, but it just was, again, understand that intersection between the real world, and this, and the excitement of a theme park is very different than, say, architectural design, where it's got to be maybe more realistic or something. Because again, a lot of the theme park designers, if you look at a lot of the Imagineers, for example, and I've got Imagineering, skipping ahead to Imagineering, but I mean, a significant number of people I know that are Imagineers used to be in game development. So a lot of people, whether they've been engineers or artists or even game designers, have all gone into Imagineering and work at Disney now designing the theme parks. So there has been a lot of stuff, because we're hyper creatives, right? We're all people that understand how to make these creative products. And so whether you're doing them for theme park design or working as an Imagineer, it takes people that have a lot of skill sets. Another thing, just as an aside, that's interesting is that a lot of game designers and game developers in general, I find, are very artistic, and I'll say that in the most general way. So like even a lot of, say, engineers that I know in game development are musicians, or they're artists, or they have other skill sets that are very. We all tend to be hyper creatives in some way, shape, or form, whether we use that in our job or not. But it's interesting to see that even a lot of game designers and game artists actually go program, and they do other stuff. Like we tend to be left brain, right brain together in game development. We tend to be people that are creatives and also kind of technical, and we bridge those gaps in a lot. Not everybody, but a lot of us tend to bridge those gaps in a lot of ways. And so that's another skill set that people like the Imagineers are looking for, are these people that can think outside that box and can solve a lot of problems in a lot of areas. They're not just, an artist or not just this, right? They want somebody that can really understand a lot of new things and try new things.
Sometimes with those other hobbies and skills, like you also don't expect to be able to use them until that opportunity comes up. Like you said, with the theme park design that you worked on, it's like you had all these previous skills back in high school or earlier on in your life where you were doing some more architectural stuff, or you're doing construction, and you probably never thought that you'd ever go back to that.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, it's anything that you learn, nobody can take away from you. So whether it's a hobby or something a little more professional, you never know when you might get the opportunity to use it. And so it's still good to kind of follow some of those paths or continue those hobbies on the side, because you never know when you might get the opportunity to be able to take that and actually get paid. Someone who's like plays an instrument and they're a game designer, and then all of a sudden they came up with the game Guitar Hero. Like there had to be actual musicians working on that game to make it work properly. So yeah.
No, and to your point there, Maxine, like I worked on a game called Bandfuse Rock Legends, which was basically, a competitor at some levels to the rock bands, but we used real guitars. Mm-hmm. And so we actually had to teach people how to play guitar, and
that's so cool.
And so it came with a cable that actually connected from the 3/4 inch, or the jack on a guitar and went to your Xbox or PlayStation or your PC. So it had a USB connector on one side and the guitar connector. And so I'll show it really quick here.
Oh, that's so awesome.
This is the box here for people that are curious to check it out. And what was interesting
so fast how quickly you got the box.
That on the entire team, I was the creative director on this project. I was the only person on the entire team who didn't play guitar. And so everybody else were all guitarists, but yeah, I was like one of the project leads and one of the guys, driving the project. But even as a game designer, I had zero experience with guitar, but it was an interesting mix because I would approach things like, look, I know nothing about guitar, guys, and this is a game, or this was a package that, again, was kind of an educational, really more educational than it was game, but again, crossing that weird world. But, I didn't know anything about guitar, yet I still helped design it, and I was able to do that because I could ask the stupid questions. You go like, why does it work that way? And I don't understand it, right? And whereas like all the other guys would make the assumptions of like, oh, that's just the way it works, and you move your fingers and, magic happens. And I'm like, I don't get that at all. Like, we got to dumb this down, right? And so, again, my ability to problem solve still allowed me to work in an area as foreign as this. Like, this was completely like me learning Chinese, or Mandarin, like it was that kind of like night and day difference of my, at first, my skill set as a game designer. I didn't know how to apply it. But again, I learned what I needed to learn. I learned enough about guitar, and I relied on my teammates to make the hardcore design decisions when it came to guitar. But I, as a game designer, knew how to make it fun, interactive, and how to make people learn and those kind of things. And so I was able to also use my UI UX skills and a lot of things like that to drive this forward. And so again, that's a perfect example. I'm glad you brought that up because of a game that I've worked on, again, that was, again, somewhere between game and simulator, an educational product, right? And we never really fully defined what it was. I mean, it was, you could play it very casual like it was Rock Band, but you also could be like super hardcore learning with it. And so again, why they chose me to be on it, I don't know, but but I did it. I spent 2 years of my life, working on that. It was a great experience with an amazing team. So, it was very cool project, but it just, again, was totally outside my skill set at some levels, but I learned and I adapted. So, and then just in general, again, product design, there's a lot of different products out there. And again, it's a very generalized thing, but again, whether you're developing software products or real products, don't underestimate your skills, again, about how to look at a problem and solve a problem and understand what a product is, understanding and asking questions about users, user experiences, all those things we've talked about today. There's a lot of things that relate there. Next is IoT, or Internet of Things, and smart cities and all that general technology. I actually spent all of last year designing a smart city. And so again, people kind of go like, well, wait a second, like, how does that relate, right? But it's that same sort of thing where as a game designer, as a game developer, smart cities and the technologies and stuff, I didn't know anything about that kind of stuff, but I figured it out, right? I broke it down and figured out how to design, these smart cities. And it was the most amazing time I've had of just completely, again, outside my element, but just learning how to design smart cities was something I was able to do. And because I came at it from a different perspective, a lot of people really liked my work because I wasn't thinking about it like the traditional architects and other people were. Are we still online, Maxine?
I think so.
That's weird. I think we had a power glitch. So hopefully everybody's still there. It looks like people came back online.
Hello? Oh,
okay.
Yes, you were. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if it glitched there for a second. I saw all the people online went to zero there for a minute. I heard my my power adapter blink, like my thing. So we must have had just a quick power spike. It's actually raining here in California today in the Bay Area, surprisingly. So, all right, glad everybody's still there with us. AI, well, this is a big topic, but again, as a game designer or as a game programmer, learning how to build AI, intelligent agents of any kind, there's a tremendous amount of transference of this over into a million different categories right now. So understanding how that's either designed or programmed can definitely be a huge area. And we won't go into all the areas of AI because that's a massively growing area. If you guys haven't been keeping up on what AI is, and if you've been doing a lot of game design and doing like NPC AI programming and things like that, there's a huge opportunity. AI is probably one of the biggest booming areas now in tech in general and stuff. And they're using AI in all kinds of crazy places now. So don't underestimate where AI can take you. Casino games we won't talk about in brief, but they're games, but they're not, right? And they have a slightly different thing. But I know that a lot of people, even myself, have gotten job offers from like IGT and traditional actual casino game companies to work on actual casino games, physical machines versus just the digital, versions of them. So there is some opportunity there. Now you got to be super math whiz, when you're going to those kinds of companies. It's all about the math and whatever. But again, they are looking for game designers in the casino games, and by slot machines and stuff, I'm talking about traditional like Las Vegas style machines, not the digital like mobile versions or whatever there. So there is some job opportunities there, which I've explored. And then team building, I brought this one up just last minute. I've done some games that were designed to actually for teams to do for team building and stuff. So kind of educational, but we did a bunch of AR games like Pokemon Go that were designed for like teams that they could play them and they would play together and have to do things together and they could see things in an AR world and it was like done for team building exercises. And I actually know 3 or 4 companies that are doing that right now, and they're looking at ways of just strengthening team building using AR and other types of technology and stuff. So again, kind of one off. I guess it's not quite educational. It's not quite anything else, kind of its own little niche. But again, the point is there's lots and lots and lots of these different things that you can do where your skill sets as a game designer and building applications and stuff and making them fun and making them engaging really, can be used in a lot of areas. So this is not a complete, comprehensive list, but I just want you guys to kind of see and understand that there's lots of opportunities out there. I don't know if you guys can kind of see this one, but this was just an example of, in the esports world, of all the different types of jobs that were in esports that were related to esports. But you can see that only a few of these are really around actually designing the actual games. A lot of this, are in a lot of different areas. And so the point of this again is that you might be in gaming, right? You might be in esports, you might be whatever, but but there's still like literally 100 jobs in here that you could be doing that are all very different skill sets and different schooling and different backgrounds and stuff like that. And you can see that like the game development is just this one little small set of areas. There's all these other things that are in all these other areas, right? So don't underestimate, you might be in this one little group right now, and you might be this one person, right? But this is kind of like the game designer, director type, this one little box, right? But that doesn't mean that a lot of these other boxes may not be open to you or that you don't have the skills to move into those. So keep an open mind and understand that, maybe with a little bit of retraining or a little bit of work, you can do anything, right? And I really, believe that. So Maxine, let's get into, you've got a bunch of slides here. I want you to have enough time to get through. So I'm
just going to try to speed through everything. I'm going to tell you when to change the slide.
Yep.
we'll do it.
Yep, go for it.
So I'm just going to dive in a little bit more into film and TV production because there does seem to be a lot of changes happening right now in that industry. And I think it is kind of close enough to that entertainment realm that, a lot of people interested in games would still find interesting. So as you've probably heard, big companies like Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, all of the big streaming companies all have virtual production departments now. This is something that all of them are investing heavily in. So things are changing kind of as we speak. And they're all planning projects which will implement using virtual production during the shooting process for CG environments, creatures, maybe, certain elements, something like that. But this is something that they're actively planning for. When I still worked at a VFX studio, this was very common. Companies like, Netflix and Amazon would be asking like, can we do this in virtual production? How about this project? What about this one? Like, how many projects can we plan further in advance? Because in a traditional workflow for film and TV production, a lot of that CG heavy workflow would happen much later in the process. And so a lot of times these creative professionals and directors wouldn't really get a chance to see what it would look like until after things had been shot. Or they would see a very lower quality version of something, maybe some concept art, maybe some early tests, but nothing as definitive as what they're doing now with shows like The Mandalorian, where they complete, entire environments before they're shot. And so they're ready on set for when the actors show up. So there's an entire sector now of on-set work that requires people to have a more technical background in programming and CG design. A lot of the existing VFX companies and studios are starting to pick that up. So they're offering more on-set services that, Netflix or Disney Plus could take advantage of. But there's still a need for specialists in this field and people that aren't necessarily tied to these bigger studios. So if you're not really familiar with how this sort of pipeline works, basically elements can be rearranged in real time during the shoot. So it gives the creative professionals the ability to kind of visualize things and see things as they're being shot, rather than, filming everything on a green screen, like most of the Marvel movies that, we know and love, and then everything being added after. And so a lot of the actors are kind of just standing in this blank space, really working hard at acting, trying to imagine what it would be like to be in those environments. Whereas now it's all about switching the schedule and the planning process so that a lot of that creative work happens at the beginning instead of closer to the end.
Yeah, like they're doing some stuff. I've seen two technologies that are being used. Some of it's VR or AR or things that allow them to previs where and how a virtual set is going to look. And then now with these really high definition LED screens and these super big televisions, for lack of a better definition, I've seen some that are doing like 8K type LED walls. And so instead of a green screen, they basically put an LED wall there, and it actually would be like the picture, like so they're shooting a video of a video basically. And so they might have a pre-made, background. And so instead of doing a green screen and then compositing it later, they're shooting it against an actual shot, things like that. So there's a bunch of different technologies they're playing with. And if you guys aren't familiar with this, Maxine, I believe there's The Mandalorian, I think, as a YouTube video I saw that had a whole explanation of their whole virtual production process, right?
Yes, there was. I can send it to you on Slack if you can put, because I don't think I can post links in the
we can put it
chat here.
For those that are watching it now, if you've got it handy. Otherwise, we can find it later, or they can search for it. But there was a couple of good videos and articles about The Mandalorian and how they're doing their virtual production. So if you guys are at all interested in that, I definitely recommend checking those videos out, because it's very fascinating. Even I watched them of just like how they're doing it and the technologies they're doing and things like that.
There's the link. There's a few different videos in that link that I just sent you. But this is what I've been watching this week. Is Unreal hosted this event called Unreal Build Virtual Production 2020. And so they've met with other industry professionals. So it's not just the perspective from the company Unreal, but also what some of these other film production companies are doing. So there's some specific ones about Mandalorian. So there's one called Production Design on The Mandalorian Season 1. And then there's some other ones, like the one I was watching today was about studio executives and how they use virtual production, what they're planning in the future for their different projects. Next slide.
Yeah, and again, keep in mind that this is a new area that even the movie guys are struggling to understand, right? So there's great opportunity, I think, in this particular field right now. Maybe in a year or two it'll get a little more solved, but I think it's still going to be something that even as they move into Unreal 4 and then Unreal 5 and all these new things, they're going to have to learn to keep up with the technologies and be more on top of things as well. And I think this is going to be an area that for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be booming in a lot of new ways and be really exciting for people. So I think that this has some huge opportunities, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. Would be a lot of fun to work in.
Yeah, absolutely. And and this is what got me so excited to talk about this today, is that like now is the perfect time to really get into this. So, whether you're considering to go back to school or if you're currently a student with us, like these are great things to talk to, your teachers, your mentors about, things to maybe study on your own time. Like I know specifically with Unreal, a lot of their educational resources are absolutely free. So you can look into this stuff on your own time if you're really interested. Maxine, this is pretty much what Mark is looking for, right? I'm not sure which Mark you're talking about, but perhaps. But anyway, I'll kind of go into this next little bit here about some of the benefits of virtual production and global health awareness. So that's just a nicer way of saying COVID. But because of the change in the industry and all of this on-set production all over the world basically halted at the beginning of the year. Now all of these companies are asking themselves, how can we achieve the same results that we have had over the past few years with all of these rules? A lot of these countries or cities have different rules that they have to, enforce in order to, make sure that people are safe on set and that there's less people. So some of the immediate benefits we can see of virtual production that some of these executives at the production studios have been talking about is, less people required to be on set because you don't have to have as many people, managing live sets or building, real environments, like construction people, stuff like that. A lot of these CG artists can work remotely and they just have to send their files to the people that work on set, and then the technical artists can control it while they're there. We have also the ability to enforce those stricter health measures. So, if you are only allowed a certain number of people to be on set at a time, then you can include different digital doubles in the scene. You could have, you can create crowds instead of having a bunch of extras on set. So there's a lot of kind of positives that we're seeing now and how we can still create these productions in this new world that we're kind of dealing with. And then a big one is this idea of having greater collaboration with less physical contact. So the ability for all of these different creatives and different parts of the pipeline, so people that are in VFX can now work with people who are, in the planning side of things, and the people that are in the shooting side of things can all collaborate together earlier on in the process rather than hearing about things later, closer to the end of a project. And then last but not least, the ability to travel to distant locations, whether it's a real location that they've recreated or it's something out of a fantasy world. You can now do virtual location scouting. You don't actually have to physically go to the locations if they've been created in CG. You can also do virtual pre-visualization, tech visualization. And again, when it comes to actors and directors, being able to actually see the virtual set as you're shooting something is such a huge asset, something that, the action industry, the heavy CG industry, when it comes to films and TV shows, has been missing for so long. It's really a new skill for actors to have to learn how to work with a green screen. It's been very difficult for a lot of people to, understand the kind of emotion that they're supposed to give in a scene that hasn't been created yet. Whereas now, you stand on one of those sets with all of the screens around you. It's a few stories tall in some cases, so it really does feel like you're there. So being, on set and seeing what's behind you, and it's a huge desert, you can it'll be easier for you to, as an actor or director, visualize what you should be doing in that scene versus a green screen where they're like, oh yeah, we'll add something in there later, just pretend it's this. They can actually see what they're working with. So it's a lot easier for people to do their jobs with these sorts of virtual sets.
Yep, for sure.
And then next, just going over some more benefits, this time kind of more on the professional side of things. So you have the ability to start a project sooner. So as I said before, oftentimes with visual effects, a lot of the work would happen later on in the whole lifespan of a movie or a TV show, from the planning phase to the final delivery phase and when it's on your screen at home. They can now collaborate at the very beginning and start to create these assets and environments and different elements earlier on to get creative approval. And what that means for VFX studios is they also now have the ability to bill the client sooner in the process of a film. So before, they would have to wait and get paid, later on, and you would be doing all of this work and not seeing the revenue side of things until months later in some cases. Whereas now, if you can complete a certain amount of the project earlier on in the planning phase, then you can bill for a percentage of that. So that's going to really change the sort of landscape of how some of these studios run, because their revenue streams are changing. And again, about the collaboration, that's a huge thing that a lot of these executives are talking about. All of the creative collaborators get to work together earlier. So between prep, shoot, and VFX, they can now meet in a common ground earlier on in the project. So they can focus on developing the creative look earlier and spend less time and money that could be wasted later in the production process, where it's a lot more difficult to change things. Like once things have already been shot, there's a lot of different challenges that come, into play when you want to change the creative look of something. So it's a lot better, overall for everyone involved to be planning the stuff and talking about the creative looks earlier on in the process. Same with reshoots. So we've heard of a lot of movies that have to do reshoots, whether, they screen it to an audience and, it doesn't do well and they change the story, or, if they have to add a character or remove a character or something changes story-wise, then they have to do some reshoots for whatever reason. Maybe it's adding a new element. You no longer have to go to that physical location to reshoot something. So if it's just adding another character into the same scene, they can just pull up that environment in this virtual production set, and it's exactly as it was before. You don't have to worry about weather continuity. So that's a big one, especially for, things like Christmas movies where it's always snowing. If it snows one day and then it doesn't the other, that's been a huge headache for the VFX industry to recreate snow or remove snow or match snow to another scene so it looks like it was all shot in the same day. Now you can just turn on the snow in the background and it'll look the same every day. It'll be extremely consistent throughout the whole film. So that level of continuity control is huge for the world of VFX, and allows for less of this like fixing of mistakes that the VFX industry is really used to. So that's going to be great, I think, for the whole industry. Again, a big flexibility for locations and filmmakers. So something that Lynwen Brennan, who's the GM and executive vice president of Lucasfilm, talked about. She said, "It looks like we traveled the world or the galaxy, but we didn't. They didn't have to. Season 2 of The Mandalorian, everything was shot on a closed set." Which is amazing. I mean, they're known for traveling the world for some of their movies and TV shows in the past. In the Star Wars universe, even if it's supposed to be on a different planet, maybe they shot it in a desert somewhere or up in the Arctic, whereas now they can do it all in one place. So it's one, set group. You don't have to have different location groups for each location. So again, it's all about being able to collaborate and have this like flexible environment in one place and not have to travel. There's a lot of expenses involved with traveling to different locations for film and TV. And then for actors and directors, no longer seeing that tennis ball or green screen. So I mentioned that a little bit before, but this is a huge game changer now, and you can see how it affects the performances and what the directors are trying to achieve in each scene. It's a lot easier to manage the look and feel of something because you can see it in camera. You don't have to wait until the VFX company kind of does their pass and adds a background and upgrades it over time as different shots get approved. It's right there on set with everyone there, and they can move certain things because it's all done in real time. So if maybe one tree is in the way, then the artist could actually take that and move it slightly if necessary, or they can move the camera around to frame it better. Yeah, that's it for that.
Next slide.
Next slide. We're having fun here with our slides, huh? See my slides. There's a lot more words. There's even more words than Troy's.
Way more.
Happy you guys are enjoying it. And then, so next I want to talk about some of the hurdles. So everyone's really quick to talk about the benefits and, oh, it's going to be so great, and look at all these new innovations. But, you know, similar to VR, what Troy was talking about earlier, it's all great, but we still don't see a lot of the big changes or effects yet. So it's still a lot of talking about how great it could be, but it's not totally happening yet. So a lot of the hurdles that we've seen with virtual production is, first of all, the ability to buy and use these large volumes. So these large screens that they're basically putting together, it's extremely costly. They're difficult to acquire. They're difficult to build because, again, there's not a lot of people who know how to build this stuff properly for the film world. So it's really difficult to actually acquire all of the technology to actually make it happen. So this idea of having pop-up volumes or for smaller productions, or using virtual production for smaller projects isn't really feasible, or it's not really a reasonable enough reason to decide to do something in virtual production. It might be more trouble than it's worth for a smaller production that has a smaller budget, or, you know, they just don't have the people who know how to do it. That's a huge hurdle right now in the industry, is just the lack of professionals, which sounds crazy when you think about it. It's like, well, like, how can they be doing The Mandalorian? How could they be creating all of these, you know, movies already that are utilizing this? But it's really not that many yet, and they're really limited to these huge productions that have the big budgets and they have the time and investment in this technology. So it's something that's still growing, and this is why it's just a great time to get into it. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, people are currently being trained for this. So ILM has their Jedi Academy for virtual production. There's companies that are doing different fellowships. I know Epic had a large grant program and a paid Unreal film workshop for professionals. A colleague of mine who is a CG supervisor, he joined that workshop, and it was a paid workshop. So as a professional who works in the industry, to be able to learn something and still get paid, even if it's a smaller amount, is a great opportunity. And so just seeing all of these different workshops, academies, and stuff like that are popping up, the fact that they're free, or the fact that some of them are paid opportunities, just shows how desperate the industry is to get more professionals. So they're really relying heavily on people doing on-set training. They want people to learn from the few people who know how to do it, and then they teach someone else, and they teach someone else. But it all comes with experience, and all comes with people who want to learn more, people that want to try harder and to get into this new thing. It's not something that's been around for a while. So, you know, there's not a lot of YouTube tutorials you could check out to learn this stuff. You really have to go to the source, and that's the few people that are controlling this market now. And so what the senior vice president of visual effects at Universal said, this guy, Chris Cram, in one of the webinars I was watching, he said, people who really know the game engine well tend to be people who work in games, obviously. So right now there's this big problem where there has to be this transfer of knowledge required for the people in the film industry to learn how to use some of this technology, but then also the people in the games industry that might be considering a career in film, they might also need to learn a few things from the film industry and how they work around the problems that they have been dealing with on set to begin with. Because even though there's a lot of the same technology behind it, there's still a lot of different foundations when it comes to creating a film and different things that they're looking for. It's a lot more about the style and the visuals that you see and the way that the shots are set up. It's a lot more about shots and scenes versus entire worlds that you're used to with games. So it's still a very different process, and there's a little bit of learning that's required on both sides of the spectrum between games and film in order for this industry to really kind of take off. But that is happening now. So that's why it's a great time to get into this and start to look into it. Even a small amount of knowledge with some of these programs is an asset to you. Being someone who says, in an interview, yeah, I know a little bit of Unreal. I'm still learning more. That is better than knowing nothing, and it still shows that you're interested in the industry, you're interested in the future of this technology, and you're someone who is constantly learning. You don't just stop learning once you graduate school. You have to keep going, no matter what industry you're in. So yeah, that's some of the issues that we're seeing right now. There's the biggest thing just being the lack of professionals. So if this is something you are interested in, this is a great time to get into it, because this is when they're looking for people, and they're currently trying to figure out how to train more. And a lot of the big companies are spearheading that.
Hey, Maxine, sorry to interrupt, but I have a hard out at 5 because I have to teach another class.
I do as well.
So do we want to call it there,
left?
or do you want to do quickly, just show them the other slides and they can come back and review them, I guess, later on the video?
No, you know what? That's pretty much it. I'm looking at some of the points I had in the later slides, and they're kind of stuff that we've talked about already.
Yeah.
There's a link to one of the talks that I was watching today, where they mentioned some roles and skills needed that these studios are looking for to build these virtual production teams. You can watch the whole webinar. It's quite long, but that part where it starts there, about 27 minutes in, is great. Basically, they just talk about a big growth opportunity that's happening right now, and just being adaptable. That is like again, I know it's really vague, but it's that skill that a lot of these companies are looking for. And they're specifically talking about younger people who grew up in a digital age that are more comfortable with change, and they're able to take on these new technologies quicker than a lot of the more old school film professionals that are used to doing things a certain way. So that's a huge asset for a lot of our students who are, considering learning online and learning things in a new way already. I think this is an interesting path to take.
Anyways, I guess we got to wrap things up. Sorry, everybody. We ran a little bit long there. We had a little bit more, but at least you guys can read the slides and see the last little bit. Apologize today. I do have another class right now that I have to teach, so people will be jumping on. But thanks, everybody, again for joining us. Thanks, Maxine, for giving us some great information, especially on this virtual
for having me.
Set production. And yeah, I wish this stuff existed 20 years ago. I'd probably be in a different field now and be doing all this virtual set production. So
hindsight's always 2020, but it's all about looking to the future.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And not getting stuck in one place,
Yep. So thanks, Big Glob and Rushback and Cassie, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you all next week. And everybody be safe and have a great week. And again, keep your options open. Understand that, if you're in this field, there's lots of opportunities out there for you. So if you're not happy making core games, just look around and you'll find other opportunities out there. And don't be discouraged that you are struggling or whatever, because there's tons and tons of opportunities out there for people that have skills in this digital world, right? So just keep that in mind and be positive, right?
Yeah. And if you are a student and you're not sure, feel free to contact me on Slack, and we can chat about whatever, your goals, your plans are, and we can try to help you find that path.
Yep, definitely. So thanks again, Maxine, and thanks everybody. And we'll have a great week. Take care now.
Later, everyone.
Bye now.